Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Ron Broglio. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute, and we're really happy today to have this event, Archives in Our Time. We've been wanting to do something on archives for a while, and then the Trump administration reduced federal funding for the NARA and their Electronic Records Initiative. It froze grants from federal cultural agencies, including the Institute for Museums and Library Services, which is a key source for archive funding. And these federal agencies have seen firings and staff reductions. The Smithsonian is being reconfigured to reflect only the history the administration sees as laudable. Unpleasant moments in U.S. history are demoted or censored, and the same is true of the U.S. national parks. So altogether, there is a concerted effort to reconfigure what counts as history and what history is accessible to scholars and to the general public. So it's with this in mind that we turn to this panel, Archives in Our Times. Archives are the essential cultural infrastructure, from oral histories to hand-inscribed annotations in books, from letters sent around the world to recipes that are kept at home, from clothing to pamphlets for community advocacy. Archives hold our collective memories. We have with us today ASU faculty who have spent their careers working with archives, and they will help us understand how archives function and explain the role of archives in preserving and in advancing culture. First, we have Jonathan Hope, who is professor in the Department of English. His research combines linguistics and literature, using techniques from linguistics to explore literary texts and literary texts as evidence for the history of the English language. Most recently, he has used techniques from digital humanities and corpus linguistics to debunk the common claim that Shakespeare invented thousands of words. He's also been awarded by the Arizona Times. What was the title of the award?
Discovery of 2024.
Yes, here's the leader of the Discovery of 2024, which was an archival discovery. He might mention it today. And he has led the NEH Early Modern Digital Agenda, a series of advanced summer institutes at the Folger. Then Mark Tebeau, who is Associate Professor of the School of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. An urban, public, and digital historian, Mark Tebeau has directed more than 24 digital humanities, oral history, and public history projects. He's co-editor of A Handbook of Digital Public History. In 2002, Tebeau served as the first public historian in residence at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History at the University of Luxembourg. Tebeau leads the development of Curatescape, a framework for mobile publishing that seeks to make open source and low-cost hosted mobile tools available to scholars and curators. And with funding from the NEH, Curatescape is being used by more than 100 cultural organizations, universities, and has heritage preservation organizations. Alex Soto, the Tohono O'odham Nation, is the director of Labriola National American Indian Data Center at ASU's library. Under his leadership, the Labriola Center has developed and implemented culturally responsive library services. It's expanded its personnel sevenfold, reestablished its physical location as cultural safe space for indigenous library users. Alex co-hosted ASU Library's first land acknowledgement statement, is the recipient of the Society of American Archivists 2002 Archival Innovation Award, and was recently awarded a $1 million grant from the Mellon Foundation for Firekeepers, Building Archive Data Sovereignty through Indigenous Memory Keeping. He's the treasurer of the Arizona Humanities Board of Directors and is the American Indian Library Association Executive Board member. Alex's journey to librarian comes after after years of success as a touring hip-hop musician and activist. So, a lot going on there. And then Rachel Corbman, who's also a Humanities Institute Fellow, I'm pleased to say, is an assistant professor at the School of Humanities, Arts, and Cultural Studies on the West Campus. Rachel is a historian of U.S. feminist and queer social movements in the late 20th century. She specializes in intellectual history of these movements. In her first book, Conferencing on the Edge, A Queer History of Feminist Field Formation, is under contract with Theory Q series at Duke University Press. And the rest of this got cut off. You have a second book underway, Crypt Theory, right?
Crypt Theory.
Right, which looks at the intersection of lesbian movement and disability studies. And we're pleased to have you all here. And we'll start with Jonathan. Thank you.
Okay, well, seeing as Ron set it up, I can say I can announce to the world that the study I've been doing on Shakespeare's supposed inventions with colleagues at Lancaster University in the UK, which was actually part funded by the Humanities Institute about 6 years ago. So this is the lead-in time on my work. We've now come up with the answer, and the answer is 401. Okay, so what I'm going to actually talk about in terms of an archives today is a very specific archive, and it's one that is in Phoenix, actually held at the Phoenix Public Library. And I want to talk about it because it's an archive that I've worked with quite extensively over the last few years, but also because I think hopefully it will be useful to begin with a very specific example of an archive. Obviously, they're all different, but they carry with them very similar issues and suppositions on the part of the people who work with them. And those suppositions are worth kind of thinking about. And I think it's best to do that from the position of looking at a specific archive. So the archive is known as the Alfred Knight Collection. It's a very large collection of books, probably consists of about 3,000 items, that was gifted to the people of Phoenix in 1958 when Alfred Knight died. Its main holdings are in English Renaissance literature, although there's quite a substantial amount of medieval texts in there, and a very large collection of late 19th and early 20th century first editions. Including some of the kind of star items, there's a first edition of James Joyce's Ulysses, slowly mouldering away, as they all are, because the paper stock is problematic. There are 2 Shakespeare folios, not a first, there's a bit of a first, but there's a second and a 4th folio, which, as everyone knows, is the best folio. And then there's also a very large collection of medieval and Renaissance astronomy and science books. And actually an even bigger collection of early 20th century Shakespeare criticism and textual, quite specialized and quite impressive textual scholarship. So it's a kind of blend of various things. We might regard this as an archive of English Renaissance books. It's got Shakespeare, it's got Spenser, it's got Ben Jonson, it's got Holinshed, which is one of the most significant early histories of the UK. And the Holinshed, some of you might know, was found to contain handwriting by John Milton about a year ago, and that was the discovery that got into the Phoenix New Times. And actually the discovery of that, we might come back to how that discovery was made, because I think it tells us something about archives and how they can be used. And I said it might be considered an archive of English Renaissance literature, because it is also an archive of other things, and all archives are archives of things aside from the thing that goes into their title. It's not representative in a strict scientific sense in terms of what it has. It has Shakespeare, Spenser, Ben Jonson, Holinshed. It has all the big names of early modern English literature. If, like me, you've studied that stuff, you'd be very familiar with the contents of this archive. It doesn't have any early modern theology. Why is that something worth mentioning? Well, for most early modern archives it isn't, and even most early modern scholars wouldn't be interested in early modern theology because it's incredibly boring and arcane, and it involves very long volumes of intricate argument over things that we now are not particularly interested in. But the scientific point is that if you look at the total amount of work published in the early modern period, probably a vast majority of it is theological work. And it's true to say that most of that work is entirely ignored by scholars who work on early modern culture. So in that respect, this is an archive that reflects current interests in early modern culture rather than enabling or representing the reality of what it was. We're reading a lot of early modern texts, but we're reading early modern texts that weren't particularly the texts that early modern people read. So what are our pictures of early modern culture like as a result of that? But there's another aspect to this archive which has kind of affected me quite a lot, which is that archives, as I tried to show, are not necessarily even representations of the things that they're set up to represent. They're actually also representations of the people who set them up. The Alfred Knight Archive carries his name, and it's not just a representation of his particular interests, although it is. There's an awful lot of books on Napoleon. But it's also a representation, I've said it's kind of an archive of the early modern period in England, which it is. It has gaps. But it's not even just an archive of that period. It's actually a very, perhaps, more representative archive of early 20th century American book collecting. Knight is kind of really interesting character in some ways, although in other ways I'll try and explain he's quite boring. He's really interesting because he's an archetypal example of something that appears in the late 19th century in America and carries on through the early years of the 20th century, which is rich guys buying books. This is a period when a lot of guys get pretty rich. Knight is not amazingly rich, although he's pretty well off. But at that period in time, if you got rich, what you did was you bought books, and you bought books that you read about in books on book collecting, and that's what Knight does. And actually, he's saved the books he had by more famous, richer book collectors that he used to buy books. So the first editions that he bought, there's not very much evidence that he was that interested in them. He seems to have bought them because there were certain books that told you how to buy first editions, and that's what he went out and did. So this is an archive of a moment in American history. Anyone who wants to know about early 20th century American history probably should know about what these rich guys were doing with their money and why they were doing it. Ayana and I stayed, and it's still going on, actually. There are still rich guys in New York importing bits of French chateaus to floors from French chateaus to put in their flats. We've seen it. But this is the kind of back end of it. It's still going on, but it's nowhere near the craze that it was then. So, the Alfred Knight Archive can tell us something, maybe more actually, about early 20th century America than it can about the Renaissance. It's also actually, it's weirdly, I went there to look at Shakespeare's folios. I found myself learning about Phoenix, and in a way that I hadn't. I first went there after I'd been here about 5 years, and I realized I didn't know anything particularly about Phoenix, didn't really understand anything about Phoenix. But tracing the comings and goings of Knight and his family through the society pages of the Arizona Republic through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s opened up a whole vista on Phoenix and Arizona that I hadn't expected to learn about, but which I did learn about. And maybe in discussions I can spill the tea on his rather sad family history, and also highlights something about the kind of adventitious nature of archives. Knight's archive is very possibly preserved because of a series of family tragedies that hit his family. He was predeceased not only by his son, his only son, but by his only grandson as well. And I suspect that meant that there was no one for the collection to go to, or in fact, no one to break it up when Knight died. And it then passed into the holding of the Phoenix Public Library. So the collections that come down to us, the archives that come down to us in many cases are telling us things that we might not realize when we first look at them they're going to tell us about. And they're also there usually not because of some great planning or preparation. They're there through accidents and through tragedy. And I'll stop there.
So it seems so weird because it's not amplified. I'm going to pick up on what Jonathan said as I tell a story about an archive I developed. The idea that archives are representations of the people who established them is a really nice expression. So I've been a public historian for a long time, but my journey into public history began in the work of a historian in the archives, which is I was in Philadelphia studying firemen, and I found this lovely collection at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It was a massive collection of volunteer firefighting records. And yet it seemed incomplete. So one day they let me go look at the shelves, right? This kind of privilege that archives used to do, I think they do less. And I found on the shelves a book that I had ignored, which was a collection of all the ledger books of these volunteer fire companies. And it contained the full collection of ledgers, of which only half were in this Historical Society of Pennsylvania collection. So I said, where are the other half? And they said, oh, I don't know. It might be at this strange museum in Bucks County, the Mercer Museum. And I'll spare you the story about the Mercer Museum and its strange history. But I went out there, and sure enough, they're molding in the basement, right, as collections do. I looked up before, in the last couple of days, I was trying to figure out what percentage of archival materials are actually available or are even cataloged. And it turns out nobody knows. But it's probably, sadly, very small that are even cataloged, and even a smaller amount that are available. So raising this question that I think we have, which is, so what's the point, right? Which is an important one. In any case, that experience at Mercer, where it was in the basement, so how do I use it? So we agreed that I would help catalog it and we would raise money. And that's how I become a public historian interested in community archiving, right? So And the experience of looking at this material, both the material culture, which is also an archive, a different kind of archive, as well as the print documents, was really astounding. And it gave me a broader sense as I began public history practice as part of my scholarship of thinking how we can support communities in what they do. And communities writ large. We normally now think about recognizing the importance of marginalized voices, but there are lots of marginalized communities that don't think demographically, right? It could be a neighborhood, it could be an interest group. You know, here in Arizona, somebody reached out to us with a hunting collection that they wanted to have cataloged, and it was really cool. So we helped them out. But those things potentially get lost if there aren't people helping collect that. So I've worked digitally for a long time. So when the pandemic happened, my colleagues and I created a Journal of the Plague Year, an archive of COVID-19, which is I get a lot of mileage out of this project still. It's the largest born digital archive of the pandemic anywhere in the world. And one of the interesting things about it is how it picks up a couple archival traditions that are really important and really are representations of us, the kind of public history community, and how we work in the 2020s. There's a born digital archiving tradition that begins earlier than 9/11, but it explodes in 9/11, at 9/11, creating a set of materials. There is this effort that I've done about supporting communities, but building on the idea that we share authority. We don't just build an archive and I say, hey, give me your stuff, right? That's not how we do things anymore. We do it through collectively working together. And the pandemic, we put out a call on Twitter, then Twitter, now X, where we said, hey, join us. And people all around the world said, hey, we'd love to join this work. And so we created a curatorial consortium that included hundreds of different scholars. And we let and communities of all sorts, and we let the community on Slack. We have over 50,000 Slack messages sitting, waiting to be archived. And by the way, that's a technical nightmare. Where they set up the framework, right? So we thought about 21st century archiving practices, recognizing marginalized voices, inviting communities in, helping communities tell their stories. We thought about but there were a couple really important kind of key ideas. One is it represents, in some ways, this shift in how we live our lives. The pandemic wasn't the cause, but it just forced us further into this rabbit hole of the interwebs, right? And so we collected in a space where things are very ephemeral, right? So one of the things that emerged that we were surprised about were memes. Memes are how we live our lives, but they're not formally collected, right? So our collectors went out and used memes to tell stories. Tiger King, maybe you remember, it was a brief blip in the radar, but it says so much. So the archive really reflects that process, that shifting, but it also exposed us to some ethical questions. What do you do with misinformation, disinformation? Do you collect it? How do you display it? How do you make sense of it? So that was one problem we faced. I won't go too far into it, but maybe we can come back to it. But we also asked questions about heterodoxy. So we discovered there are lots of people out there during the pandemic, people who own restaurants who were right-leaning, who wanted to keep them open. They were creating groups on Facebook, so we went out and invited them into our community. But they refused, right? Because we're the state, right? We represent to them the liberal state. We're the enemy, right? In fact, I went to the Facebook group and shared my story, and eventually they kicked me out, right? So, but the question is, how do you collect those stories? Because who's collecting that kind of narrative? And how do you describe it then? And the final thing we did, which I think is an increasingly interesting dilemma for all of us, which is how do you make sense of digital materials? Just putting something on the web without curating it, without giving it value, essentially means it gets lost forever, right? So how do we curate? And so one of the things we did is we curated simultaneously the people who shared their stories, curated objects, our curators curated objects, and now we're even using AI to see if AI curates it better than the curators. And I can say more about what AI can do and can't do. And it can't replace humans, but it actually is oddly humane, which is a strange thing to say. But I think the point of telling about this archive is just to reflect back on what Jonathan said. It's about who we've become as archivists. And to us, to me, I don't know if it's true for everybody on the team, it continues to reflect the challenges and limitations of working in this space, which the problems seem to be growing and the challenges seem to be growing. So.
Sklikdash, onion up, chugi, Alex Soto, onion up, amjik, kawalsik, dono optum amjik. So, as mentioned earlier, my name is Alex Soto, director of the Labriola National American Indian Data Center, which in short is our indigenous library here at ASU. And I state that as far as who I am and where I'm from, because my view, my assertion of archives is more or less rooted in what I said, that I'm thon autumn, meaning that on the land that we're sitting on now, we're on autumn jubad. And within that, as indigenous people, we have various stories and ways to communicate who we are, whether this was time immemorial back in the day or sitting right here in 2025 around community memory. So in relation to archives, just like everything else in indigenous communities, it's just another form to assert our indigeneity. Right, if we're fighting for our land, in most cases it would be an illegal arena. If we're looking for ways to, share our medicine in a contemporary sense, it might be natives and STEM. But in the case of myself, who is a librarian, and I'll just put it out there, a dope rapper who happens to be Tonaotham, first and foremost, librarian and who I am, not just because of my skin color, is that obviously my lived influence or lived experience is going to speak to this conversation that for indigenous people, it's always been about sharing knowledge and that way, and community memory, and doing it in a way that keeps our communities healthy through cultural wellness and being who we are and whatever times we're in. And so in the case of being now a person who's in this line of work or profession or academia, wherever you want to start, is that we have to find ways to use this and indigenize it. But before we get there, we need to know what it is and decolonize it. So back to the Labriola Center to speak to the collections we have around the corner and at West Campus, is that it's quite unique archive because it's an archive focused on indigenous peoples, histories, and cultures. But keep in mind with the Labriola Center, it just didn't form with my arrival there. It's been around since 1993. That was when it was created by an endowment. And there's even a backstory, which I might get into in terms of why library was important for Native people to establish, or ASU library to actually, set up, back then for our Native populations. Because, right, we're Native faculty, Native students. There's so many of us now. But at that time, especially in 93, there wasn't a lot of us. And also knowing that indigenous information was just hard to find. So example, with the work we do now, it's continue a larger legacy of what indigenous librarianship is, which is the ability to blend Western frameworks such as librarianship or archival praxis with indigenous knowledge. And in that, knowing that it is a push and pull, because in some ways those are oxymorons, right? Having our own way of mediating information, sharing our stories for traditional settings, but oh wait, now we're in 2025 and I have to use this book. So with the Labriola Center emerging, it was part of a larger movement around indigenous librarianship, in particular in 1977, Vine Deloria Jr., who is an American Indian Studies acclaimed academic and name in that line of AIS, basically had a paper that was called The Right to Know, that indigenous people need the right to know, to find their information. And it was in relation to a White House conference proceeding to the Carter administration to say that here we are in 1977 trying to educate our Native students, but we can't find our information because it's lost in the settler colonial archives that have cataloged us in various derogatory, dare I say, ways where it's hard to find a collection on Tonaotham when the subject heading is Pima Indian, because that comes from settler colonial experiences when Spaniards came to talk to my people in the 1600s and they're speaking Spanish, we're speaking Autumn, bien much. I don't know what you're saying. Oh wait, that must be their name, Pima. So in that experience, that turns into the control vocabulary, the metadata, which then leads to, we got Pima Indians. So when I hear the word Pima, it basically says, I don't know. So don't go to Pima Community College because it says, I don't know community college. Or down south in Tucson, right? But anyways, all that gets to finding our information. And so now in 1977, a lot of resurgence of natives at the time going to school, the activism in the 60s and 70s, we had to find framework to be able to find our information. So back to that paper in 1977, a lot of folks started to get more involved with libraries and archives, recognizing they were already gathering stuff, right? Their collections would just come together. So in that, the origins to some degree of the Labriola Center that we have comes from that urgency to say, hey, well, we don't entirely, see this as some super rare collection that's in prestigious archives in Europe, but we know this has community memory. This has material about language revitalization. This has historical documents, dare I say, around land disputes, where in Western law, if you have the paper trail, you should be able to assert that in the court of law to fight for your rights. So all that to say, it wasn't just a matter of we need to find our archive to be able to educate our young people. It was also knowing, oh crap, we can use this for the law, in terms of advocating for our land back. And so back to the Labriola, and the reason I mention all this history to get into what we're doing now is that there was a librarian at ASU Library before Labriola was around. Her name was Mimi McBride. And she was a standing route Lakota librarian that worked here long before, we knew, or a lot of librarians in the field. And she made a point to say, we need to establish American Indian Information Clearinghouse. And that's the word, language at the time in the 80s, right? Clearinghouse. But essentially what she was saying is, I see at ASU we have a growing native base and also community members in the greatest Phoenix area, and we need to be able to provide culturally responsive material that speaks to their lived experience and their history. So that's kind of the roots of the Labriola. Fast forward to 1993, it's simultaneously in the Gila River Indian community, 20 minutes down the road. There was a business owner who operated on the res, retired, wanted to give back to the native community, so he actually left a pretty substantial endowment, which actually was supposed to go to the Gila River Indian community. For whatever reason, they didn't want it, so it came to ASU. So it was a perfect storm of, here's someone who wants to fund a native library, and here's this, woman, Lakota woman wanting to put one together. So all that came in 93. For whatever reason, and this is back to the archives because we still have some of her material. We don't entirely know why she left ASU in 93. I'm assuming just because Pallet is being a brown person working in academia. But all that to say, from 93 to 2021, it was under non-native leadership. Fast forward, I came in this role. At that time, it was a house of one person on staff line. Since then, as mentioned, we have 7 full-time Native people now to enact what Mimi McBride and our ancestors, our OGs and Indigenous librarianship wanted, which was we need to have an Indigenous archive so we're able to do this work to help our community. In this context, it's get them for schools, get them their primary resources, but also recognizing Native people see the words like archives and books. These are just Western words. So although we are a distinctive collection, have 10,000 distinctive rare books, we have 51 manuscripts that touch on land issues, touch on Native rights, touch on Native history. We also have all the rare books. We also have 5,000 circulating books, because when Native students come to our space around the corner, when I walked over here, there's like 20 of them just being themselves. They're surrounded by Indigenous knowledge. They're surrounded by books that might be in the bookstore around the corner, but in that it's going to spark their mind to realize, oh wait, I need to know these archives, because back to academia, rigor, secondary source, primary source. So all that to say, the Labriola has emerged as and I have to quote it as the provost said, Nancy Gonzalez, the one and only Indigenous-led library in the continental U.S., because only Hawaii has something similar. And I say that is that in my work now as a librarian, speaking and doing workshops, Society of American Archivists, American Library Association, all these, fancy, prestigious organization, is that, people want to create space for folks like us, but also they realize it's a lot of work because you don't have relations. And it just gets into having, it's one thing to have an Indian collection, which we see a lot in, the U.S. of all these native rare books. But it's another thing to have someone like myself or my staff who looks like them, who can meet them where they're at, to be like, yes, here's your written book or your archive, but why do we need this? What's the framework? How do we use this for sovereignty? How do we use this for self-determination? And so for the Labriola Center, that's a lot of what we do. It's for sure an archive. It's all the things you can imagine having books. But within that, it's also how do we we essentially empower our community to use this information to address social ills in our community, and depending on what it is, even fight for our land. Because those who are unfamiliar with the book called Network Sovereignty by my colleague Marissa Duarte, you know, there's silos across the country that have all the paper trail about how they stole our land. And it's in some government, you know, silo somewhere. And just imagine we had access, we had indigenous librarians, and then digitize all that material. It would be very interesting in the courts, but minus what's happening now with the courts. But in that to say, if this is the written word, right, and we want to be quote unquote civilized in the context of settler colonial society, well, here's the proof. And that's what we tell our students is, yes, the books are great, the zines are great, all these lived experiences, but in this world where we're in right now at ASU, academia, you're going to have to know how to use these archives. So back to archives in our time, I think it's interesting that an archive can just be that third space to be able to show this is this context. I'm not getting into politics, left wing, right wing, chicken wing, all that. I'm just simply saying, like, here is the facts. If folks want to start disputing that and say it's disinformation, on one hand, I'm obviously pissed because that's BS because we have the primary source. But in that, I would argue as an indigenous librarian, misinformation as simple as that Columbus found this continent. And think about how that's been perpetuated for 550 plus years. Well, that's just how it is, Alex. I'm like, well, he didn't find anything. He was just lost. You know what I'm saying? But in that, you know, that's back to archives. It has that point of view. It gives you that perspective. You know, because in our collections, we have, you know, activist collections that speak about marginalized communities' positions on these issues. Example, the Phoenix Indian School. For those unfamiliar, the state of Arizona almost sold that whole plot to the state of Florida back in the 1980s to have a huge mega plaza there or business, you know, set up. And it wasn't for a Native woman activist, Jean Chardardi. She, you know, we wouldn't have the Indian Park, right, or Indian School Park. But in that, it's like showing that there's history there and these collections can be used. And that's one that's in our collection. And we met the family and we had a big event for her two years ago at West Campus. But it just shows like it's not just, you know, I'm going to be scholarly and look like Indiana Jones in the archive, right? I'm going to have to use this information for a larger purpose. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, so my remarks are going to pick up on a lot of themes that have been kind of covered throughout the panel. So I wanted to start by like giving a little bit of context about how I enter this conversation. So I'm trained both as an archivist. I got a professionalizing degree in archives from NYU, and then I got an interdisciplinary degree, a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Stony Brook. I'm, as Ron mentioned at the beginning, I'm kind of broadly speaking an interdisciplinary historian of feminist and queer social movements in the 70s and 80s. So to a certain extent, like sometimes my work is archival in that like I am a historian, I go to archives, and then I write historical narratives based on archival research. But I'm gonna give two examples of like cases where like the kind of relationship between my work as an archivist and my work as a historian are kind of more like messily entangled with one another. So the first is about 5 years ago, I became interested in some like very weird performances that Sarah Schulman did, and I'll explain who Sarah Schulman is in a second, in the early 80s when she was like 25 years old. So Sarah Schulman is an activist, writer and community-based historian. She's probably at this point best known for her book, Let the Record Show, which is a history of ACT UP New York, which was a AIDS activist group that she was also a member of. So anyway, out of this conversation with Sarah, I ended up being hired to process her papers, which were 74 linear feet of material, so like 74 archival boxes. They were, it's a very long and complicated story, but they were sort of at an archive, but sort of not. But I would stay at her apartment when she was not there in New York and go and process her papers. And we've recently sold them to Harvard. So they're going to be open at Harvard in a few years. So the kind of like outcomes of this are like both like kind of scholarly and also archival. So I have the aforementioned like weird performance that like initially inspired my interest in like reaching out to Sarah. I have an article in Science that's coming out next month about this performance, which I won't really have the time to explain, but it might come up later. And then also she now continues to like send me her papers when like things fill up in her apartment. She sends me them, and they're now in my office on West Campus. And then like when it gets to be enough boxes, we'll sell them again to Harvard. So that's one example. And then the second example I want to talk about is I've been a coordinator of the Lesbian History Archives for many years. The Lesbian History Archives is a community-based archive in Brooklyn, New York, that was founded in the 1970s. So this was like a time when there's like a lot of grassroots work around lesbian feminism, and a group of lesbians got like kind of galvanized around the fact that this was not being collected by traditional archives and libraries. So they just took matters into their own hands. It was initially in the founder's apartment, Joan Nestle's apartment on the Upper West Side. It gradually took over her apartment. She joked that like there was just her bed, which was like her space, and the rest of it was the archives. So by the 1990s, it moved to its own space in Park Slope. This is the building in Park Slope. So I've been a coordinator of the archives since 2012. And the project that I want to discuss that I worked on with the Lesbian History Archives was, so this past summer, the New York Liberty, which is the WNBA team in Brooklyn, as the photo illustrates, they just won the championship in 2024, which was the first time they've won the championship. So they reached out to the Lesbian History Archives about doing a collaboration. So for people who are not familiar with Brooklyn, they're very physically close to each other. So this is about like a 40-minute walk. That's Prospect Park, the park that's near the Lesbian History Archives, and basically the Lesbian History Archives is at one corner, and like the Barclays Center is like kind of like at the other corner. It's about a 40-minute walk. So they're kind of like local neighbors with each other. And then also just like personally, this was like a very exciting email for me to receive. This is a photo from my little sister's bat mitzvah in 2003. She had a WNBA-themed bat mitzvah. The WNBA was founded in 1997, and we were like season ticket holders in the early 2000s. So as I said, this is from 2003. So like dream email, obviously. So we worked on a activation. They have activations each game, which are basically just like different things for like fans to do in the concourse. So it's like after you enter the arena, but before you go into the game, they have like different things going on in that space. So we did an exhibit, and we also, as I'll show you, did some giveaways along with the exhibit. And I should mention here that this was funded partially by the New York Liberty, partially by LIFT, and partially by the Humanities Institute. So I'm very grateful for the support from the Humanities Institute for it. We had, again, like it's a little exhibit. It was partially archival documents that documented the history of lesbian fan culture, and partially photos that we solicited from fans in a photo drive. Then, as I said before, we also had giveaways that were inspired by the archival material in the exhibit. So specifically, in 1999, Jess Dobkin, who's now a performance artist in Canada, and that's her with Maddie, who was the mascot at the time, kind of accidentally founded this group, Lesbians for Liberty. She she created this banner that said Lesbians for Liberty and tried to take it to a Liberty game, and she was kind of almost kicked out of the arena. They told her if she unfurled her banner, they would kick her out. So she like got a group together, and they came back the next game, and they did unfurl their banner, and that became the Lesbians for Liberty. They were kind of sort of lovingly protesting the New York Liberty, and especially the kind of marketing of the league at the time, which was deeply apprehensive about the connection between like lesbians and women's sports. Jess Dobkin at one of the games created this paper fan, so it folds up together, and it says "Lesbian fans fill your stands," so it's like a play on fans, obviously. So we recreated a new version of it. Hannah Pennington, who was one of the curators, created this. So it has "Lesbian fans fill your stands," and it has the new mascot, Ellie, on it instead. And we also created stickers that were inspired by the Lesbian for Liberty stickers, but like hologram. and like a button that's inspired by this flyer. And then finally, we're working with Anastasia Inicardia, who's a artist in Brooklyn, had an already existing collaboration with the Liberty, where she created these little mini prints that are sold in vending machines. So there's a vending machine at Barclays that like sells these at all the games. And so she created a separate mini print for us that was based on this photo from press coverage of a Lesbians for Liberty Kissin' in 2003, which was a game I was actually at and remember as like I think I was like 15 years old. So here's her mini print based on it, and just because it's hard to give a sense of scale. Yeah, so it's like tiny, it's like this big. And so it was at Barclays Center for the game, which was Pride Night, and then after that we moved it to the LGBT Center, and it's a little bit expanded in this version. And it first of all, like the game was sold out, so there's like 17,000 people at this game, and there was like a line to see her like tiny exhibit on foam board, which was just wild to see as somebody that spends most of my time like sitting at home writing. And then it generated some press coverage afterwards, and also before too. So there's a feature article in them, which is actually very good, a more recent review in Autostraddle, and I did an interview for KGZZ. And also Alyssa has done a fabulous job of like promoting it and wrote her own small piece for Humanities Institute as well. And then like kind of like two sort of takeaways that I would like sort of throw out to close. So this is something that I've realized like in all of my kind of public historical work, but like meeting people where they are is very important. In this case, like at Barclays, but like just in general, that people are interested in history and the humanities, but just you have to like go to where the people are and like give them the kind of the historical stories that like relate to their own lives and they can see themselves in. And then also like I was thinking about this especially with Ron's description of it. This collaboration did make me more optimistic than I had been about like the possibility of corporate partnerships that like especially in a context where like we're seeing a lot of the opportunities for this kind of work just like disappearing federally, that like maybe that is one avenue that like is still open in this moment.
So there's some time for questions now. I'm wondering, just to start things, if you can talk generally about the role of curation, because that's a decision-making process by which you then have to decide what are the standards by which you make those decisions that affect both how the archive is received, say, by scholars or set by scholars, but also how it's received by publics. One of the things that I found really interesting here is in all of them the public interface and how important that was to really reinvigorating the archive.
So I'm just going to jump in. And so the 9/11 archive, which was ostensibly in public history the firstborn digital archive, has no curation. So it is a collection of materials, and you can go see it today. And it's overwhelming, and there's no way to make sense of it, right? So that was part of what we did, is the idea that we wanted to curate it actively so that as the material came in, we could make meaning, whether it's accurate or not. Like, it's less important in some ways. If we make how we make meaning transparent, people can process that. We also thought, and this is in relation to something Alex said, that the people who are sharing their story deserve the right to tell us what terms and how they wanted it curated. It may not be an academic curation, which our students really demanded academic curation, which is kind of funny. But it was kind of funny because they were more insistent upon it than we were as their faculty. But the idea is that we wanted to have these things in conversation. And I think it's really important to try to return that agency to the communities who are sharing their knowledge. So
I'll add to that, and back to a lot of what I mentioned with this, our assertion of librarianship as Indigenous people, is that we want to create culturally safe space for our students and users. All that to say means that historically, there's a lot of bad, derogatory, outright racist stuff about Native people. So as a librarian and an archivist, we have to be mindful of our scope of what we're sessioning in and how we're sharing it, because we don't want to be perpetuating harm because, oh, wait, let's bring all the Native stuff on said tribe and it's for cultural whatever. And of course, if you're a non-Native person trying to curate something and you don't know what these photographs depict of ceremony or these audio visual material that has songs, on one hand, from a Western perspective, oh, what's the big deal? It's just your cultural heritage. It's like, well, first of all, those should have never been recorded. And in that, fast forward to the question, at the Labriola and the ASU library as a whole, we adhere to the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, which is a standard that's been endorsed by Society of American Archivists. So these are not just things here in the Southwest. At a national level, these high-level archival societies have agreed that historically there's been issues in the archives. One, what we collect, how we describe it, how we curate it, how we share it. So the protocols, or PNAM for short, that's the acronym, is our way to, one, review our collection, which under my archivist, Vina Begay's leadership, has gone through all our collections and flagged a derogatory content / material that might have ceremonial information for initial run, because certain things, and trust me, and I can point right now on the third floor where it's at, there's some books that are just wild on what non-natives have gathered on our ceremonies and detailed in great, in the archive 200 years ago, right, or first contact, where you're like, why is this even written down? And depending on your indigenous culture or tribe, that can get your community sick and doesn't promote that health, that wellness. And so back to PNAM, to ASU Libraries, Leadership's Credit, Society of American Archivists, that's how we curate. So we're like, okay, well, let's make sure everything we have is okay to share. And in that, yes, it's have historical context because we're ASU, dissertations of that nature, but where are the newer contents of seeing our Native authors, our Native poets, Native, scholars sharing our ways of knowing, to put all this in context. And luckily, this past decade or two, we've been able to have more Native scholarship in that. But think about it, 100 years ago, there was no Native authors telling our stories, and or the people who were running the place didn't look like me. So it gets into like there's historical disparities, and the protocols help us with curation, because in the protocols, you can Google it now, everything we're talking about, how to curate, how to steward, best practices, all that was in 2006. And we're like the only place in the whole country implementing in a tangible way what those steps look like, according to our colleagues. But anyways, that's how we curate based on those values we have at Labriola.
There's 3 questions from the online attendees. The first question from Kate. Have any of you experienced archive funding cuts firsthand? If not, could you share how you feel these cuts will impact archives, libraries, museums?
Have we personally experienced cuts? Yeah. So I can talk on behalf of the Lesbian History Archives, which I think as an organization has been like unusually like well suited to like kind of weather this moment, precisely because the Lesbian History Archives has like, for political and strategic reasons, never accepted any federal grants whatsoever. And it's also been a volunteer model since it was founded. Even though it's like, we own a building now, so it's not just like in somebody's apartment. And there are ways that it's like shifted to like I don't know, like have a budget and have nonprofit status. But yeah, it relies on money from like from mostly community generated money, and then to a certain extent like some kind of like partnerships, like Gale's a company that like digitizes primary sources, and then like archives that it works with get like money from that. So that's been a big source of revenue, because it's never really like run on all that much money. So like this would be like a tiny part of other archives budgets, but like is a significant chunk for the archives.
I would actually just real quickly reverse that question. Community archives have never been funded by the federal government, right? They originate in the community. They often originate with people who are amateurs, who aren't credentialed, and so that has historically been a group that groups that don't receive support at all. So in some ways, I think the challenge now doesn't look any different than it has probably, I don't know, maybe to the early 2010s. I'm not even sure if those kinds of community groups would receive support in today's today's environment circa 2020 or 2022.
So actually, in relation to the Alfred Knight archive, the same applies really. A slightly different context, although, yeah, he weirdly to me didn't, when he gave the books, and I think a lot of people think that's when they're giving a gift to an archive, they think they're being nice. Actually, they're saddling an archive with potentially a lot of costs. And I say it's weird because Alfred Knight was actually basically an accountant and worked with money in various companies and should have known, and was on the board of the library as well. But maybe he thought that would get him some extra resources, but he should have known that. And the library has I mean, it's great they have the archive and it's kept safe, but they have real problems in opening it up to anyone, because that means a member of staff has to be there, and they don't have the staff.
And to speak to Mark's point around the word or wording community archives, for sure everything was noted. It's folks who just doing the work, right? Sharing, documenting, preserving that history. I think for Native people, it gets a little complicated, where initially when I got into this line of work, especially coming out of library school, there's that urgency. There's all this information you want to store. But for tribal communities, one, where does it go after you digitize it? Because it gets into a conversation. It's one thing to scan something right now, but another thing, where's the community-driven repository that's powered by our tribal nations if we use framework like indigenous data sovereignty or cultural sovereignty? So for me, I felt it was a disservice to one degree to get folks worked up on the res, like, hey, scan your photos of your grandparents back in the 50s and 60s, but then you don't know how to manage it. So it's like, on one hand, like, it's good that you digitized it, and it gets into digital literacy, things break down, you need maintenance, you get into these complicated questions, which on one hand, I guess in the U.S. society, liberalism, it's like, yes, it's the individual, it's their responsibility. But for tribes, this is cultural heritage. So that's why with Mellon Foundation, we basically got $1 million funding to explore all those avenues to make localized repositories and have my staff to help train our community members on how to address best practices, so you're not just having to scan photo and then throwing it away because you don't understand about preservation, and two, thinking it's digitized and it's forever locked in. And then, oh, by the way, where's it going to be stored? On the cloud? That gets into encryption, and it gets into what I said earlier with stories. So it's very complicated, but also very 1990s solutions that come out of our project, and hopefully Mellon's going to fund us for a second round from what I'm all gathering. But it is different, because on one hand, historically, a Native collection would just end up at ASU Library. But we're like, well, what if the tribe doesn't want it there? They just want technical support. Flip side of that is, in an ideal world, all our tribal libraries, archives would be on point, but funding. Or folks like me are, not able to be in those positions because we don't know what the hell a library is. I don't have a bun just checking out books and saying, hey, we're librarians. It's like, no, it leads to a larger conversation of culture or knowledge protectors. But that's my 2 cents.
Okay, great. I mean, we're kind of out of time, but I'm just going to read these questions so that people are just aware of what else is being asked. In the age of information, where anyone with an internet can be their own archivist, how big do you think misinformation is as an obstacle to that? And the other one, how as archivists can we help not only the communities we're making connections with, but the general public understand what we do and why it's important? So I think these are kind of lingering questions, and it's, I think, one of the reasons we have the passions we have for this kind of work, and its future. Hopefully there'll be other opportunities to continue these conversations. In fact, October 9th, so there's a series of archive talks going on. October 9th, John DeMillo will be here talking about the history of LGBTQ archives. And then on November 6th, with the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, Emma Smith will be talking about archives in medieval and Renaissance material. So thank you for joining us, and let's thank the panel for their participation.